And it's time for Uncancelled, where Britain's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of the cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. Tonight, I'm joined by Brendan O'Neill, columnist and editor of Spiked Online. The myth of so-called white privilege has been exposed after the Education Select Committee ruled that white working-class school children have been let down by decades of neglect in England's education system. Tory chairman Robert Halfon said poverty is not to blame for this major social injustice, as ethnic groups on free school meals perform better than their white peers every step of the way. Instead, he pointed to terms which promote disharmony and lead to neglect of disadvantaged white pupils, prompting Labour to accuse him of trying to stoke the culture war. However, in a column for Spiked Online, Brendan counters that in this case, culture war is a class war in drag, arguing that white working class people have been slandered by the elite as dumb, narrow-minded and xenophobic for daring to fly the English flag or support Brexit. Brendan added, the children of the native white working classes too often expect too little of themselves. Education is something to get through rather than to be challenged and changed by, telling white working class children who are lagging so severely behind every other social group that their skin colour bestows upon them some kind of lifelong privilege is just perverse. It's cruel. In fact, almost a form of mockery. And to take this topic on more, Brendan O'Neill joins me now live. Brendan, it's great to have you on the show. Great to have you part of Uncancelled. This was a very powerful column. But what do you say to the Guardian headline writers and the members of the Labour Party on that committee who say, look, this is just someone like you attempting to stoke the culture war? What's your response to them?
I think the real culture warriors are the people who are demeaning white working class communities all the time. I think there is a culture war against working class people, and they are constantly being demeaned. They're being told that they are stupid. They're being told that they were racist for voting for Brexit, that everything they do is racist, essentially. That's what they're constantly being told. And you can see the effect of that in schools, as you've just described. Poor white kids on free school meals are doing worse educationally than every other social group that is also on free school meals. And that tells us something about the impact that this culture war against the white working classes, this demeaning of them as idiots, regressive idiots, that's having a detrimental impact on that community and especially its young people.
And the point that you make, Brendan, is that the likes of The Guardian will run towards any sort of demographic story if it involves non-white ethnic groups, but when it's a story about white working class folk, they don't want to even touch it.
Yeah, if you look at a newspaper like The Guardian really makes me laugh because they are obsessed with social groups. They're obsessed with the supposed repression of various different sections of society. But as soon as someone says white working class, they're kind of clutching their pearls. You know, how dare you talk about these people? That's racist to talk about white people. It's ridiculous to talk about the white working class. These terms make no sense. They will really rage against anyone who talks about that section of society. And I think this raises a really important point about identity politics, which is that it is obsessed with race and gender and transgender and those kinds of issues, but it really has nothing important to say about class. And class is still the main determinant of how people do in life. It determines what kind of education you get, what job prospects you will have, what you might do with your life. Class is a very powerful force, and it is something that we should be talking about more. Liz Truss made this point a few months ago. She said, we've got to stop obsessing over issues to do with race and gender, although they can be important issues. And we've got to talk about the class and geographical differentials between communities in this country. The fact that we now have Tories saying, let's talk about class, and supposed leftists saying, no, we can't talk about class, that tells us how screwed up politics has become today.
Yeah, I think it does, because when you look at all of these schemes, for example, run by the BBC, they're never about class. They're always about race and gender, which means that a lot of these underprivileged white working class folk aren't getting the help they need from the institutions who should actually be trying to give them a leg up.
Yes, diversity is always about race and gender and sexuality. It's never about class. It's certainly never about opinion. You know, the BBC and other institutions that wax lyrical about the importance of diversity, it's never about diversity of thought. You know, everyone in those institutions tends to think in the same way. And it's also not about diversity of class. It's not about ensuring that working class kids and working class people can move up the ladder in the way that they were doing a few decades ago, before that kind of that situation changed, and we now find ourselves in a bit of a dead end in relation to class. So yeah, when we hear the term diversity, it really means just getting a few more non-white people in positions of influence who think the same as the establishment itself. It doesn't mean thinking about the deprivation and the difficulties that most working people face, and that's working people whatever their background. It's not about addressing those problems, it's just about tinkering with how things look. And the fact that the left is going along with this idea, this notion that class is less important than other ethnic or gender disparities, I think that is a real indictment of the left and the way in which it has abandoned working class communities.
Do you think that's why working class voters seem to be turning away from the Labour Party, and there may be another example of it in Batley and Spen tomorrow night?
I think so, absolutely. I've been waiting all my adult life for the working classes to turn against the Labour Party. I've never understood why they didn't do it sooner. You know, the Labour Party was founded to represent working people. It did that on and off for a few decades, but in the recent past, it has become incredibly hostile to working class people. It now looks upon them as this horrible blob, the uneducated, unfit, mentally regressive, xenophobic, stupid, low information. I mean, all these terms of abuse are wielded against ordinary working people by the Labour Party and by many people on the left. And that is why working class people are turning against the party that was founded to represent them, because it's now a party that is incredibly hostile to them. And I think the issue that summed that up best was the vote for Brexit. You had all sorts of people voted for Brexit, of course, but lots and lots of working class people voted for it, including working class Labour voters. And what did Labour do? It said, the vote for Brexit is the biggest disaster this country has ever faced. It's horrible. It's disgusting. We have to prevent it from happening and have a second referendum. That is why the Red Wall collapsed, because working class people felt that Labour had stabbed them in the back. And I think it will take a very long time for Labour to recover those voters, if it ever will.
I think you're completely right on that. Well, look, let me bring in today's panel to join the conversation. We have Calvin Robinson here, we have Daisy McAndrew here, we have Kirsty Gallagher here. Daisy, is there anything you want to challenge Brendan on there?
Not so much a challenge. I mean, it's actually it's a sort of a thought about how we haven't progressed as far as diversity, as far as class, and particularly, I would say, public school versus state sector. When we look at things like media, politics, influential people, there is still so many. There's such a majority of public school educated people. And I just think this is one of those things that doesn't tend to get a lot of attention and is one of the reasons why there is that groupthink.
Yeah, I think one of the great tragedies of modern times is that so many areas of culture and politics and the media are still dominated by either privately educated people or very middle-class people. They have colonized all of those institutions, and the working classes have been shut out. I mean, even something like pop music. the great thing, if you look at the greatest pop music in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, right from the Beatles through to the Smiths through to Oasis, these were working class bands. These were expressions of working class ideas and working class concerns. But if you look at pop music now, they're all double barrel surnamed poshos who make, not very good music as it happens. And so even something like pop music has come to be colonized by very posh people. And then, of course, there's politics and the media and the judicial system and everything else. So the class differentials in this country are getting worse. And I think that's something that we really have to think about, the question of why social progression is going backward at the moment.
Calvin, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. And Brendan, thank you for calling out diversity as being a code word for anti-white these days. The problem is, in our education system, we talked about the American school earlier, but there are many, many other schools falling for this, white privilege, black victimhood mentality. But we have legislation in place to protect against it. We have the Equalities Act, we have the Education Act, and they're not being enforced. How do we stamp out critical race theory and identity politics from our public institutions if the legislation isn't being used to do that?
I think we just have to challenge it and confront it and really take up the argument and push back with better arguments. I'm worried about the idea that we should ban critical race theory. That kind of makes me uncomfortable because I think the problem with banning things or pushing them under the carpet, however obnoxious we might find them, is that you never really deal with the argument. You never satisfactorily crush the argument and put forward a better alternative. So it's a complicated issue because I think critical race theory is a very toxic ideology. It's not a theory at all. A theory means being open-minded to the possibility that you are wrong. It means testing ideas out. It means having public discussion and public debate. Whereas critical race theory is essentially a new orthodoxy that you're not allowed to criticize or else you'll be called a racist and potentially cast out of polite society. So it's not a theory, it's a rigid set of ideas and very problematic ideas. All white people are privileged and horrible, all black people are victims and lacking in agency and in need of special assistance. It's very divisive, very paternalistic, and it rehabilitates the racial imagination, which is not something we ought to be doing in the 21st century. So it needs to be confronted, but I think the best way to confront it is with open debate, challenging ideas, and proving to the public that there is a better way of approaching these issues.
Fascinating as ever and a brilliant column. Brendan O'Neill, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to my panel, Kirsty Gallagher, Calvin Robinson and Daisy McAndrew.